G'day, it's Professor Joseph Drew, and I'm here to talk to you about the scholarly publication process. Most people don't understand how it works. I guess if you're not an academic, you wouldn't, would you? And they don't understand why a scholarly publication is so much more valuable and so much more reliable than what we find in the grey literature. And by grey literature, I mean publications by some of these accounting firms that no one's reviewed, it hasn't gone through a scholarly process, publications by governments and government departments. There's a reason why a scholarly publication is more robust and more reliable, and you're about to find out all about it, and you're about to find out what I do for a living. I've got 75 publications from some of the best journals in the world, and I've edited 4 A-ranked journals, so I'm in a good position to be able to describe the process for you. So step one, of course, is to write a paper, and that is a long pursuit. Typically, someone at my level of academia is writing 5 papers a year, something like that. Generally, a paper will take a month or 2 to write. It is a big endeavor. You spend a lot of time planning it, a long time developing an existing theory that can be adapted to what you want to do. Of course, you've got to go and gather the evidence. Most of my evidence comes directly from audited financial statements for local governments, and then I get other evidence from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. That's all got to be put together, and that's a very exhausting process. Then you've got to read the relevant academic literature and cite the literature through your paper. And typically, if you look at a reference list from my papers, you're looking at 15, 20 papers I've had to read and cite and understand before I can go about the process of writing my own piece of work. And then, of course, you've got to conduct appropriate empirical analysis. Now, I'm a mathematician by trade. My first degree was in maths. I have a master's in accounting, a PhD in economics, and postgrad in theology. And my empirical analysis is quite sophisticated maths. It's what's called econometrics. It's the maths that economists use, and that's got to be done properly. And that's a very difficult field to learn and a very difficult thing to do. It takes a long time to make sure you've got that model perfect. And indeed, to do so, you need to run lots and lots and lots of models to make sure that it's resistant to what we call specification error, and lots of tests to make sure it's right before it goes anywhere near a journal. Once you've gone through that exhausting process, which, as I say, often takes months, you then submit the paper to a journal. Now, there is a journal ranking system that Australia uses. Well, it's supposed to be phased out, but most of us are still using it. So we have A and A star journals at the top. Then we have B ranked journals, then C ranked journals, and then unranked journals. They're usually unranked either because they're very, very new or they're very, very ordinary. Most of my publications are in A and A star journals. I did have a period where I was doing a lot of publications, 12 a year, and some went into Bs simply because all the A journals told me to go away. They were seeing me too often. But the far majority of my journals are in A ranked journals. You submit the paper, which is a long process in itself. Each journal has their own way of setting out the citations and the references, and that takes 2 or 3 hours just to submit the paper, and then you've got to go through an online submission process. And then we try to do what we call passing the desk. There's a desk editor that reads the paper and decides whether it fits the journal, whether it's good enough to be bothered sending out to review, and does basic checks for plagiarism and things like that. If you pass the desk, the paper then gets sent out to an absolute minimum of 2 blind reviewers. A lot of the journals I go to, 4 or 5 reviewers. Now, what is a blind reviewer? That is someone that doesn't know you. And in fact, they're asked that if they know you and they have a conflict of interest to declare it, and then they don't become a reviewer. Someone that doesn't know you, someone that has published a bit in that journal, someone that has a good standing, a good publication record. Not all academics do have a good publication record. In fact, a lot of academics only have a few publications. So these are experts in their field, and they will read through your paper and interrogate it very closely. Very critical people, academics. They like nothing better than to criticize someone else's work. They don't enjoy being criticized themselves, but they love to criticize other people's work. And the criticisms are usually very specific. on little details. One word used quite a little bit imprecisely makes a big difference to some reviewers. And they can be quite vicious and quite hurtful. You've got to have a thick hide to be in this game because you will attract criticism, doesn't matter how good you are. So then the reviewers write reports on your paper and they send them back to the editor. And the editor looks at those reports and says, is this paper savable? Can these authors actually do what's required to get in my journal or not? Now, if the reports require a lot to be done or the reviewers are recommended reject, it'll just get rejected and you've wasted all that time. This review process has probably taken 3 months, although since COVID it's more likely to have taken 6 or 9 months. And then you've got to go through the whole process with a new journal. If, however, the reviewers are saying, look, we want revisions, and the editor thinks it's doable, he will ask the authors to do revisions. Now, when you do revisions, you must satisfy every reviewer. Now, what almost always happens is one reviewer asks for one thing over here, the other reviewer asks for the exact opposite, and somehow you've got to try to keep everyone happy. Doing a revision is a huge exercise, 2 or 3 weeks work. I've got one to revise right now for our A-Rank Political Science Journal. It's a huge deal, it takes a long time, and it's actually harder than the writing the paper because you've got to work within what you've already done. We've got strict word limits at every journal. Typically you're only allowed to have a paper go up to 8,000 words, and yet you've got to add all this extra material to keep everyone happy and to keep both sets of reviewers happy. Once you've done that, it goes back to the reviewers. They read the review, they read the reviewed manuscript, and they read my report on the revisions and decide whether I've done a good enough job. They may ask for more revisions, that happens quite a lot, or they may say, look, no, it's good enough. It then goes back to an editor, usually the chief editor at this stage, who looks through it again and may ask for extra things. Once you've done all of that, it gets unconditionally accepted for publication. That means it will definitely be published. Now, the journal process is quite slow. A lot of the journals only put out an issue every 3 months. So after the acceptance, it may be a year. I've had journals 2 years, A-Rank journals that take 2 years before the thing's actually published on paper. But usually what will happen in the interim is it'll get published online and people can access it straight away. So the process is very rigorous, the process is very time consuming, and it's quite exhausting. And to get in those top international journals, particularly if you're writing about Australia, I can't tell you how many top overseas journals have written back to me and said, brilliant paper, great idea, never been done before, love the work, but it's about Australia. It's such a small and insignificant area, we don't think our readers will be interested. Or we get the great paper, but too Australian. Mind you, the paper's based on England and never too English, and the paper's based on America and never too American, but too Australian. If I had $1 for every time that was written, I wouldn't have to earn a wage. I'd be earning far more in my tips for being discriminated against because I'm an Australian writing about Australia. But our crazy journal ranking system in Australia actually means that we rank the best journals overseas, not in Australia. So the federal government, by way of the university, pays my wages, but most of my papers get published overseas because that's what the government originally ranked as the best journals, and we're all still following that old system. So it's a little bit crazy. The government's paying academics essentially to write papers that get published overseas that no one in Australia will read because they're overseas journals. Really, really crazy. But there's a lot of things that are crazy about the local, the university system, and I intend to make more videos later talking about PhD processes and talking about editorial processes and things and promotions. And you'll find as you go that it's a very, very peculiar industry. So for all those reasons, you can trust an academic paper. You can't get rubbish work through. You've got to get through a desk editor. You've got to get through 3 expert reviewers that don't know you, who have no other interest in life other than making your life a misery and picking on every single little dot that's missing. You've got to get through a chief editor, and then it gets unconditionally accepted. You can trust that. Now compare that to the stuff that they're putting out by some of these accounting firms. They write it in-house, they might read it and check it. That's it. No independent persons looked at it. No scholarly experts looked at it. The people writing it probably, let's be true about this, probably don't have any expertise. and that's why grey literature is unreliable. Same with government reports. It gets written by someone that may or may not have expertise. It'll probably get checked by a department head, but it's not going out to a blind review. An expert in the field who doesn't know you, whose job is to pick on every single little conceivable problem. It's just not going through that process, and you just can't trust it as much. Now, this is a very blurry picture of my Google Scholar page. There's two things that academics use, Google Scholar and ResearchGate. If you want to know if an academic's any good, type the name in, then go plus Google Scholar or plus ResearchGate. Now, some academics won't have a profile. That means they don't have many publications. So you can draw your own conclusions about their research capacity and ability. But the good academics will have a page. Look mine up by all means. There's scores there that you can see, and you can see the total citations. I'm getting close to 1,000 citations, so that means 1,000 other scholars have cited my work and said that it's good work. So there's a broad consensus that I know what I'm doing. Usually for a paper to be a good paper, gets up to 10 publications. That contributes to your I-10 score. That's a really good paper. Papers that have got more than 10 papers are awesome papers. So yeah, look up some Google Scholar pages and some research pages. Here's another one to look at. Brian Dollery, more publications than anyone else in the world. My former boss, my mentor, and my great friend, I'm very happy to say. Look up his Google Scholar page, but please don't compare me to him. He is the best in the world, has published more than anyone ever will. I won't live long enough to publish that much. Anyone academic who's got more than 50 publications, they know what they're doing. They're good academic. Anyone who has I-10 score more than say 12, they're good academic. And same with the H index. Anyone that's got a H index more than 10, 12, you're looking at a good academic. But it's important for people in the local government community to know, particularly when consulting's involved. And I do consulting. I've done consulting in the past, both privately and for my universities, on economics and accounting matters and finance matters. When you're looking at a prospective consultant, if it's on economics and finance particularly, it's not so important if it's community engagement. You don't need to be a scholar to do community engagement. But if it's on economics, finance, boundary reform, you need to see if these people actually know what they're doing. Check out their Google Scholar page. You'll know pretty quickly. Okay, thank you very much for your time. I hope that's cleared up what academics do for a living. Thank you.